Rhodesian Bush War lasted from July 1964 until December of 1979 between the Rhodesian state and the Marxist guerrilla groups Zanla and Zipra. There's a lot to this conflict and it's very complex, but this video is solely about the American Crippled Eagles who were volunteers in the Bush War. Volunteers had come to fight for Rhodesia from all over the world. The Rhodesian government had actively recruited personnel from other countries from the mid-1970s until 1980 to address manpower shortages within their security forces. It's estimated that between 800 and 2,000 volunteers enlisted. Like other foreign volunteers in Rhodesia, the Americans would often receive a hostile reception from their comrades in the Rhodesian units, and this led to some Americans deserting before the end of their contract. The U.S. Neutrality Act prohibited American citizens from enlisting with foreign militaries or working as mercenaries for other governments. Despite this, the U.S. government did little to slow the flow of volunteers to Rhodesia. There is evidence that even the Departments of Justice and State would encourage Americans to volunteer for Rhodesia as part of efforts to prevent the country's collapse to communism. The Carter administration considered taking steps to further stop Americans serving within Rhodesia, but they did nothing to change the policies, and the activities of Americans in Rhodesia were widely publicized within the United States. One of the reasons for many American citizens joining the Rhodesian Bush War was Soldier of Fortune reports about the war as a means of entry into the Rhodesian Army. From 1976 to 1980, almost every issue would contain one or more articles about the ongoing conflict. The first issue of the magazine in 1975 actually contained 2 articles prompting some Americans to travel to Rhodesia, and after 1980, the magazine would turn its attention to Angola and other hotspots around the world. Approximately 400 Americans would volunteer to fight in the Rhodesian security forces during the Bush War as ordinary soldiers, earning a pay packet in local currency equal to that of a Rhodesian regular under the same conditions of service. The Americans would suffer 7 combat fatalities, and many others would be wounded in combat, some would be maimed for life. 5 would end up serving in Rhodesia's most prestigious unit, being the Salo Scouts. Of those 5, however, only 3 would actually see combat with the Salo Scouts, as one was kicked from the course for falling asleep during a water detail, and another was in non-operational status because he didn't go through selection, but remained in the training group as a sergeant. American and Australian volunteers who had fought in the Vietnam War were generally well regarded by Rhodesian soldiers, and were often posted to elite SAS and Salo Scouts units. These volunteers may have encouraged the Rhodesian security forces to use the body count of guerrillas killed as a measure of success, this having been the key metric in Vietnam. Volunteers with prior military experience, particularly Vietnam veterans, were often fast-tracked into operational roles due to their combat proficiency in bush warfare tactics, though all were integrated as regular soldiers rather than mercenaries, receiving equivalent pay, uniforms, and conditions of service. This integration emphasized merit-based assignment, with Americans distributed across units without forming segregated formations, and there were an estimated 300 possessing combat experience from Vietnam who would be integrated into airborne and special operations roles, leveraging familiarity with bush and guerrilla tactics to support Rhodesia's efforts. The majority of the volunteers were assigned to the Rhodesian Light Infantry, which was an airborne commando regiment specializing in rapid response operations against insurgent groups. Leveraging their familiarity with helicopter insurgents and small unit patrols from Vietnam, the Americans would contribute to counterinsurgency sweeps and denying operations. Smaller contingents who joined the Rhodesian SAS focused on long-range reconnaissance and cross-border raids, where their skills in unconventional warfare were particularly valued. The Fire Force operations was a hallmark tactic involving helicopter-borne troops and paratroopers responding to ground contacts with the encirclement and elimination of insurgent groups, often achieving localized superiority through speed and firepower. Vietnam veterans who applied their knowledge of air-mobile insertions and small unit ambushes that were honed against Viet Cong forces to adapt similar low-intensity conflicts in Rhodesian terrain. This expertise aided in the execution of combat jumps and pursuit operations, which contributed to the Crippled Eagles' reputation for high engagement rates during the war's escalation from 1972 onward. Select volunteers joined the Salo Scouts for pseudo-operations, disguising themselves as insurgents in small teams to infiltrate guerrilla networks, gather intelligence, and conduct ambushes along the borders of Mozambique. John Cronin, a U.S. Marine with 2 Vietnam tours from 1967 to 1969, commanded 4 such teams after 18 months in the Rhodesian Light Infantry, utilizing passwords and insurgent protocols learned from prior guerrilla engagements and experiences to penetrate Zanla supply lines and staging areas. These missions required endurance and deception, disrupted enemy logistics, and provided actionable intelligence for larger strikes, with the Americans' field craft from Southeast Asian jungles proving to be extremely valuable in mimicking terrorist movements. Notable operational involvement included American trooper Ken Gaute in Operation Urich in September of 1979, which was a cross-border incursion into Mozambique targeting Zanla bases, where Rhodesian light infantry elements supported armored and airborne assaults to degrade staging infrastructure. Overall, their tactical input bolstered Rhodesian forces' ability to react in outnumbered scenarios, emphasizing the initiative and vertical envelopment through broader strategic constraints that limited enduring impacts. Robert C. McKenzie, a Vietnam vet who served in the U.S. Army's 101st from 1966 to 1967, enlisted in the Rhodesian SAS in 1970 after passing its rigorous selection. He rose from private to captain and squadron commander by 1980. McKenzie participated in near-continuous counterinsurgency operations against the insurgent groups across Rhodesia's operational areas. In 1979, he received the Silver Cross of Rhodesia for gallantry and leadership in action during a high-intensity engagement, as well as the Bronze Cross of Rhodesia for operational valor. Another notable engagement that involved Fire Force tactics was 1978's Operation Gatling, where multinational volunteer elements, including the American Crippled Eagles, struck deep into Zambia to disrupt Zipra logistics through individual American roles in the raid that remain undocumented in primary accounts. These operations emphasized precision ambush and helicopter-borne insertions that again leveraged the volunteers' prior combat experience against the guerrillas in hit-and-run tactics. In 1976, author Robin Moore established what he called the unofficial U.S. Embassy in Salisbury and began hosting events for American volunteers as well as doctoral students. He encouraged the volunteers to call themselves the Crippled Eagles due to the perception that they were being harassed or could be harassed by their government. He also sold t-shirts, sew-on patches, and other merchandise using the Crippled Eagle motif, and would write a book that argued that Rhodesia was not racist, which included profiles of foreign volunteers. A lack of commitment to the Rhodesian cause would then contribute to desertions. Some American deserters decided that Rhodesia was doomed and not worth risking their lives for, including after events which made them feel unwelcome in the country. An American volunteer would desert after 5 months in 1976, and actually considered joining the guerrillas after he developed the belief that Rhodesia was racist. However, volunteers who expressed extreme racism were deported from Rhodesia, as 80% of the Rhodesian armed forces were black. Some other volunteers left due to the hostile reception they received upon entering the country, as well as from the Rhodesians who they served alongside. In 1975, 2 American volunteers, being Craig Atchison and Joe Belisario, were arrested in Botswana while doing a job for the Rhodesian security forces. Both men were leaders of the fanatically anti-communist group known as Veterans and Volunteers for Vietnam, an organization which had vowed to keep sending Americans to fight in the Vietnam War following with the withdrawal of all forces, and the 2 were convicted of firearm charges and each were sentenced to 6 months in prison. John Allen Coe was the first American killed in Rhodesia. He served in the Rhodesian SAS until he was kicked out, likely due to his outspoken political beliefs, and afterwards he served in the Rhodesian Light Infantry in the 2nd Commando with the attached Rhodesian Army Medical Corps. He participated in several cross-border raids into Mozambique and was killed in action on July 19, 1975 by a gunshot wound. George William Clark was the 2nd American killed in Rhodesia and was a Marine Double Purple Heart recipient and Vietnam veteran. Prior to joining the Rhodesian Light Infantry, Clark had served as a paramedic in Richmond, British Columbia, Canada. He was 28 years old when he was killed in action on May 15, 1977. Next, an American neo-Nazi was killed on December 6, 1977, in Gaza Province, Mozambique, from friendly fire during an SAS patrol. With this, it's important to note that while most volunteers who fought for Rhodesia were motivated by anti-communism, some were motivated by racial prejudices. And like I said before, volunteers who openly expressed extreme racial views or neo-Nazism were deported from the country and banned from service. Frank Battaglia fought with the U.S. 173rd Airborne in Vietnam and was reportedly wounded twice. He also served a full contract with the Spanish Foreign Legion and came to Rhodesia with his wife and went to Sea Squadron SAS training troop. After the SAS, he joined the Rhodesian Light Infantry in 3 Commando, where his wife also served in the Rhodesian Air Force for packing parachutes. He was an avid poker player and gave some Rhodesian soldiers poker lessons while playing matches. He was also killed in action on March 6, 1978, in Zambia during Operation Turmoil. Joseph Byrne joined the Rhodesian Army in October of 1977 and was a regular in the crowd of foreign volunteers, and he was a friend of American author Robin Moore. He joined 3 Commando of the Rhodesian Light Infantry on March 24, 1978, and he was killed in action during Operation Repulse at the age of 26 on October 26, 1978. Hugh John McCall was a Vietnam vet, having served in the 173rd Airborne as well. He was killed in action on July 16, 1979, on the Buffalo Range area in Rhodesia proper. Stephen Dwyer had previously served in the U.S. Marines and was stationed in Korea. He joined the Rhodesian Light Infantry and was killed in action at the age of 27 while coming to the aid of the fatally wounded fellow American Hugh John McCall. And that is the American volunteers in the Rhodesian Bush War. What other aspects of the Cold War would you like for me to cover? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.